Welcome to the inaugural podcast series for Tapestry Reassembled, about the 2024 election. I'm Edie Song, your host, joined by Kate Ross.
Thanks, Edie. You know, voters often have to choose between the lesser of two evils, and this time it's worse. President Trump's rants are disjointed and illogical, although crazy enough to be entertaining in a dumpster fire sort of way. Democrats hate him for his personal attacks on them and the media, which make his followers happy, but they also kill any chance at bipartisanship.
He even criticizes and undermines people in his own party. He bullies them into submission, with their only option to just wait him out. But on the other side, Vice President Harris is running on President Biden's record, now that he's left the race. And she didn't help her cause with all of her word salad gaffes, which were even worse than her hiding President Biden's dementia.
He'd said he'd unite us, but never kept his campaign and inauguration speech promises to reach across the aisle. He signed executive orders and pushed his policies unilaterally, instead of negotiating to get compromise solutions in place as a president for all Americans. And it didn't help things when he called most Republicans ultra-MAGA and blamed them for unsolved issues, when compromise would have at least started to solve them.
Both parties act like the only compromise they can accept is for the other side to completely cave in to whatever they want. That ain't governing.
Sadly, there's almost no chance of a third-party candidate winning the presidency. The two parties dominate in every state, and their campaign infrastructure gets enough party loyalists out to vote to stop anyone who isn't a Democrat or Republican.
Are we stuck with the divisiveness? Are we stuck with election results in a handful of states, where narrow 48% to 47% victories produce electoral college wins? Victories that they then claim are massive landslides that they justify as a mandate from the voters for their extreme policies that half of the country doesn't agree with?
Those are great questions, Edie. If Harris gets back enough traditional Democratic Party voters who look like they were gonna vote for Trump, or if Trump squeaks by like Biden did with fewer than 100,000 votes separating them in the swing states, there's no way that the split in Congress will produce any meaningful bipartisan solutions to the problems that face the nation.
I'm worried about this country, Kate. We have huge issues, whether it be governing, social, environmental, security, or economic. Single-party solutions make little actual sense to everyday Americans.
You're right. Common sense isn't all that common, as the saying goes, but voters know it when they see it. Sensible solutions should be appealing regardless of party affiliation. That's why it seems as if an alternate candidate could appeal to independents and cross-party line voters. Just look at the polling earlier this year. Something like 70% of voters didn't want either Trump or Biden to run again.
That's right. But any alternative candidate would have a high hill to climb. They'd have to be smart enough to identify sensible solutions to the issues and principled enough to not care whether they pissed off either party's elites. RFK Jr. is kinda doing that, and to a lesser extent Cornel West and Jill Stein are too. But they all come across as wacky and out of touch, and certainly not in the political center.
I agree. They came from the extreme wing of their party, kinda like libertarians are pretty much extreme small government Republicans. Polling earlier in this race probably still applies with Harris in there, that 60 to 70% of voters would rather not pick either of the two candidates.
It sure would be great if there was a strong candidate who could appeal to voters in the center who actually want nonpartisan solutions to our problems, who wouldn't be part of the crippling division that is so damaging to the U.S. and our future.
I think most voters would be thrilled to hear real workable solutions to the issues that we face, and a presidential candidate who planned to solve them when taking office, rather than just pushing for one party's or the other's pet solutions. Those solutions typically reflect what the special interests and big donors want, not what's best for the country. Voters could probably be convinced to reach out to their senators and congressmen to say that unless they're willing to work with a candidate putting these workable solutions out there, they weren't going to get their vote.
That'd wake them up. And we all know what needs to be fixed. There are 8 major problems that just continue to grow worse while the two parties snarl and scheme, and it's the American people who suffer. The federal debt and deficits are ridiculous, and both grow under both parties. The economy is shaky, with wealth and income inequality at dangerous levels, and more people than ever living paycheck to paycheck. The healthcare system sees massive spending, and yet huge numbers of people aren't covered. There's an environmental crisis that won't go away with the policies either side's been putting forward.
Yeah, and don't forget about our educational system. It's way worse than other developed countries, and yet we fight over things that have little to do with closing the gap. The immigration system is broken, and neither party has a plan to put it together again in a way that preserves our welcoming history and yet still respects those who follow the law to immigrate. And all those sanctimonious speeches about crime either ignore the rights of victims or trample on the rights of defendants who are innocent until proven guilty.
And the biggest can of all gets kicked down the road. Social Security is out of money in 10 years, and the only solutions will be to reduce benefits payments to avoid default or go even more into debt. But nobody has the maturity to touch the third rail of politics and keep the train from going off the tracks. Let's face it, we need a better candidate than whoever the two main parties are offering up. One who has solutions to each of these issues that both parties can agree on.
Well, let's just say for a second that we got our wish, Edie. What would you think such an amazing candidate would propose that would really solve things and get voters fired up? That's the real purpose behind this podcast.
Dude, I'm glad you asked. I think the first thing they'd have to talk about is basic government reform, as part of the effort to reduce the deficits and debt. The bureaucracy is out of control, and nobody thinks it's efficient. There's way too many departments for anyone to manage all of it effectively. I think if you shrank some to get rid of all the huge headquarters and mid-level bureaucrats, that would automatically cut costs and improve how efficiently they do things.
Yeah, when you think about it, a bunch of them are really trying to solve problems that fit into one overarching goal, to create a healthy economy. I'm talking about agriculture, energy, education, environmental protection, housing and urban development, interior, labor, transportation, and treasury. That's 9 cabinet departments that could all be merged into a commerce department responsible for government regulation of all of those sectors of the U.S. economy. Right now the president has to try to manage each of their separate efforts on the economy while also dealing with domestic politics, the military, homeland security and foreign policy. It's incredible to think that we should consistently expect to have presidents who are totally skilled in all of those.
Your idea about the Commerce Secretary is a great one. Think about it, one person with one job, advising the president on all matters regarding the U.S. economy, and guiding and integrating all 9 of those separate departments' involvement in it to make the whole thing work better.
And if you take the Secretary of Veterans Affairs position and make it a Deputy Secretary of Defense, that would shrink the number of cabinet members to 6, all reporting to the President and Vice President, the Secretaries of Defense, Homeland Security, State, Commerce, and Health and Human Services, plus the Attorney General. It's so much easier to manage 6 people instead of 15 to 20.
And like I said earlier, it gets rid of the massive numbers of middle and upper level bureaucrats who've been there for decades to run all those separate cabinet level departments.
Plus there's an additional efficiency and spending cut that a restructured Commerce Department can push for. A lot of corporate welfare has built up over the years in the departments that have stood alone to date. Some of it you gotta have to counter foreign countries' subsidies to their economies, but most of it is just pork. The Secretary of Commerce should get rid of corporate welfare ere U.S. businesses are already adequately competitive, and keep it where there's strategic security issues.
For sure. I mean, I think Bidenomics was supposed to try to solve that and other issues by managing economic change from the bottom up and the middle out. But that was a campaign slogan, not a policy, and people at the bottom and in the middle know it. The reality hit hard. Inflation has beaten them down, and the increase in interest rates is just horrifying. Credit card bills and car loans eat up the money people are making with their higher wages.
And we've seen the news reports about more people than ever living paycheck to paycheck, with a huge increase in the number of people facing that who are making over $100,000 per year. People who like Trump know that what we've seen from the Biden-Harris administration isn't working, but don't seem to realize that his half-assed 3-part plan for no tax on tips and big tax cuts and big tariffs are only going to make things worse. They won't bring inflation down, they'll drive it up.
Yeah, he keeps talking about how great the economy was before the pandemic, and it was pretty good, but that's just because there was continuation of the long, slow Obama recovery from the Great Recession. It took 6.5 years to get back the 8.5 million jobs that were lost, and then 5 more years to add another 12 million jobs before the pandemic.
Then it took until August 2022 before we got back to that level. Since then, we've only added about 3 million jobs, but the population has grown by 7.4 million, and that doesn't count illegal aliens. Plus, when you look at the data, a huge and growing number of jobs are part-time. A lot of people have 2 jobs, and because they're often both part-time jobs, that means they don't get benefits. Did you know that over the past 12 months, 1.5 million full-time jobs went away, and 1.8 million part-time jobs replaced them?
It's clear that people are hurting, Kate, and the public opinion polls show it. 75% of Americans think that the Biden-Harris administration is taking the country in the wrong direction. But in their defense, the U.S. economy is so huge, it's hard for any president to affect it. Still, we know that 4 things definitely do: spending, tax policy, trade policy, and regulations. What common-sense policies do you think a third candidate could talk about to energize voters?
Well, when a patient has cancer, the doctor usually says we need to do surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation therapy. All 3 of those beat down the patient, but they have to happen to save their life. So even though it sounds like the worst campaign strategy ever, raising taxes and cutting spending are the only things that make sense. Voters know that the best thing a president could do for the U.S. economy over the long term is to run surpluses. Our debt has grown bigger than the economy, and we've gotten into this mess by running huge deficits for years. To get out of it, we need to run surpluses for years. Staying on the path we've been on is like smoking 3 packs a day after the lung cancer diagnosis, or keeping your foot on the gas pedal as you drive toward a cliff edge.
You know that Congress is going to hate to cut spending, because that's how they get all of their campaign donations, by promising pork. Well, the candidate has to convince voters to tell their representatives that surpluses are the right thing to do, just like cancer treatments. And they know it's smart since running surpluses at home does the same thing. It pays down their debt principal and cuts interest payments to make them better off financially. The same applies for the country.
So what kind of spending would you cut? I mean, we already talked about cutting spending by reducing the size of government and making it more efficient, but that's not going to get the numbers needed.
That's true. I think a candidate would also have to include in the debt reduction strategy moving infrastructure projects to state and local governments for financing and execution. Traditionally, we push to have the federal government pay a large percentage of the costs. But that just offloads costs to taxpayers in other states that get no benefit from the projects, or really it just moves the bill into the deficit. So we're paying for things today and claiming we'll pay for it later, but we never find the money to do that.
Yeah, but the problem with moving the costs to the state and local governments is that some states or cities have a lower tax base, so they'll have a hard time affording the kinds of infrastructure improvements needed to make their citizens' lives better. In higher tax-base wealthy areas, it'll probably be fine to reduce if not eliminate the federal share of costs. And even there, they'll likely have negative financial and economic impacts. The individual state legislators and executives will need to make choices to adjust their own tax policies, and in a similar way localities will also need to change the way things are done. There's no free lunch. Everything comes down to prioritizing what's truly necessary and what isn't.
Maybe for the sake of areas that can't raise as much, by increasing local and state taxes, the federal government should still be involved. It would probably make sense to use a formula of some sort that takes into account just how wealthy a particular state or local area is, like how much poverty is there. In that case, it's not a total elimination of federal funds, but it can focus those funds that remain, say 25% or even 50% of what's there now, on the communities that are worst off.
Yeah, that cuts federal spending all right. Okay, what was next? Tax policy? I think we should pick up with that on the next episode, Edie. I'm Kate Ross. Thanks for joining us, everyone.